Hello, I am here today to talk about how and why we use Punnett Squares. However, I wanted to give you some background knowledge before I jump into how we use Punnett Squares. I want to start by talking about chromosomes. Chromosomes are made of DNA and code for the traits we see in human beings, like hair color, eye color, skin color, etc. Most of our body cells, the cells that are not used for reproduction, cells like skin cells or muscle cells, have 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes. You can see this in the human karyotype I have on the screen that is showing 23 pairs of chromosomes or 46 total chromosomes. Let's look at pair number 1 right here. One of these chromosomes came from this person's mom, and one of these chromosomes came from this person's dad. So you get 23 chromosomes from mom, 23 chromosomes from dad, and in a human body cell, they end up in pairs, one from mom and one from dad. Let's look at next at chromosome number 23. This pair is found right here, and these are called our sex chromosomes because they determine our sex. If a human has an X and a Y chromosome, that person is male. If a human has two X chromosomes, that person is female. So, how do humans get 23 pairs of chromosomes or 46 total chromosomes in our body cells? Well, we get 23 chromosomes from our mom and we get 23 chromosomes from our dad through sexual reproduction. Before sexual reproduction, humans produce sex cells, sperm and egg cells, which are called gametes. Each gamete has half the number of chromosomes as a body cell, or 23 chromosomes. These are produced through the process of meiosis. We can see two examples of what chromosomes would look like in human sperm and egg cells here. Notice that each example only has 23 chromosomes, half the number we find in human body cells. However, after these gametes combine, the resultant cell would have 46 chromosomes or 23 pairs of chromosomes like we see up here. So during the formation of these gametes, human egg and sperm cell, each parent can only give one chromosome from each pair to their child. For example, if we look at chromosome number 22 right here, this parent can give only one of these two chromosomes to their child, and it's a 50-50 chance of which chromosome their parent will give. Furthermore, if we look at the sex the sex chromosomes, females have two X chromosomes and therefore can only give one of the two, but since they're both X, females can only give X chromosomes to their children. If we look at the male sex chromosomes, males have an X and a Y chromosome, and the male can give either the X or the Y, again, a 50-50 chance. If the male gives an X chromosome, it'll pair with an X chromosome from a female and form a female child. If the male gives his Y chromosome, it'll pair with an X chromosome from the female and form a male child. So, the big thing to remember here is that when sperm and egg cells combine, the new cell that is formed has 23 pairs of chromosomes. 23 of these chromosomes came from mom, 23 of these chromosomes came from dad, for a total of 46 chromosomes in those body cells. Here is a diagram showing a generic human karyotype of chromosomes in body cells. And we can see 23 pairs of chromosomes or 46 chromosomes total. The only catch on here is that it's showing either an XY or an XX chromosome down here. This person would only have one of these two pairs, either XY or XX. Okay? You can also see these shaded regions within the chromosomes, right, that are shaded in either gray or in black. And these regions are called genes. Genes are regions on chromosomes that code for specific traits, things like hair color, eye color, skin color, etc. For example, this shaded region right here may code for hair color. This means that the shaded region of both chromosomes, both the chromosome that came from the mom and the chromosome that came from the dad, would both code for the same trait at the same place, in this case, hair color. However, not all genes code for the same version of the trait. For example, this gene right here this might code for brown hair. And this gene, the same gene on the other chromosome coming from the other parent, this gene might code for blonde hair. We call genes that code for different versions of the same trait alleles. So this shaded region right here would represent an allele for brown hair, and this shaded region on the other chromosome from the other parent uh, would code for blonde hair. And so we would call this a blonde hair allele. So we have a brown hair allele over here on this chromosome from dad, and a blonde hair allele on this chromosome from mom. And since we get 23 chromosomes from our mom and 23 chromosomes from our dad, it's the combination of these alleles from each parent that actually determine the traits that we have. So we represent the different alleles of genes using capital and lowercase letters. Dominant alleles are represented with capital letters, and recessive alleles are represented with lowercase letters. Therefore, it's the combination of these alleles or genes that determines our traits. Let's look at some of the alleles that determine hair color. The dominant allele for hair color is brown hair, and the recessive allele for hair color is blonde hair. Therefore, we will use the letter B, or capital B, to represent the gene for brown hair, and we will use the letter lowercase b to represent the allele for blonde hair. Let's look at some of the possible allele combinations for hair color and talk about what they mean. Here is an example of two chromosomes which both have the allele for brown hair, which is a dominant trait. Therefore, we use capital letters for each allele. In this case, a capital B for both. Remember, a dominant trait is a trait that covers up a recessive trait. And we'll talk more about this in a minute. This example here is called a homozygous dominant pair of alleles because both of the alleles are dominant. The prefix homo means the same, and the way that I remember this is with the word homosexual. A homosexual is a person who has a sexual preference for a person of the same sex. Since both of these alleles are the same, and they're both dominant, we call this pair of alleles homozygous dominant. The next example I have for us is called a heterozygous pair of alleles because the alleles are different. We have one capital B and one lowercase b. Remember, the capital B represents the trait brown hair, which is dominant, and the lowercase b represents the other allele for blonde hair, which is recessive. The way that you can remember this is that prefix hetero. I remember the word heterosexual. A heterosexual is a person who has a sexual preference for somebody that's of the opposite sex or a different sex. So this word hetero means opposite or different. And we can see that the alleles are different. We have one capital letter and one lowercase letter. And the last example that we're going to look at is called a homozygous recessive pair. Again, homo meaning the same, and then recessive, they're both recessive traits represented with lowercase b that represents the trait for blonde hair. Now, let's talk about the genotypes of each of these individuals for hair color. A genotype is the set of genes or the set of alleles a person has for a specific trait. So all we have to do is look at the set of genes that this person has for the trait, and that's the genotype. In this case, the genotype is capital B for a homozygous dominant set of alleles. In this next example, the heterozygous pair, we have one capital B and one lowercase b. Those are the sets of alleles or genes for this particular person on their chromosomes. So we say that this person's genotype would be capital B, lowercase b. And then for our last example, the homozygous recessive, both of these genes code for the recessive trait, right? For blonde hair, both use a lowercase b, so the genotype would be lowercase b, lowercase b. Remember, the genotype refers to the set of genes for a specific trait, and geno sounds like gene. So genotype refers to the set of genes. And now for the really exciting part. What do these different gene combinations of alleles code for? In other words, what physical trait would a person have based on these different genotypes? Well, a physical trait is of a person is called their phenotype. And the way that I remember this is physical starts with ph, just like phenotype. So you can think of phenotype equals physical feature, okay? And the phenotype is based on the genotype. Or another way of saying this is the genotype determines the phenotype. I remember physical for phenotype, okay? So let's look at this first example, the homozygous dominant pair. We see two capital Bs. Since capital B codes for brown hair, and both of these alleles code for brown hair, this individual would have brown hair. So we say that this person's phenotype would be brown hair. In the next example, or the second example, in the heterozygous pair, this person has two different genes. Remember, hetero means different or opposite. So we have one gene that codes for brown hair, which is dominant with a capital B. The other allele is represented with a lowercase b, which codes for blonde hair, which is recessive. Now, the dominant gene covers up the recessive gene. And so even though this person has a gene for blonde hair, what you would see is brown hair, because brown is dominant over blonde. You can think of it as like a stronger older brother, and it covers up that blonde gene. So a person with both the brown hair gene and the blonde hair gene is going to show brown hair. They're going to have brown hair as their phenotype. And then in the third example, the homozygous recessive pair, the genotype is lowercase b, lowercase b. Remember, lowercase b codes for blonde hair. And so since there's not a dominant gene in this pair, and both of the genes, both of the alleles code for blonde hair, this person would have blonde hair. Now, I want to make one little quick note. I just want to point out that the only time you see the recessive phenotype or the recessive allele is when both of the genes, both of the alleles are recessive. It's the only time you can see blonde hair in this case. Because if there was a capital B, like over here, the capital B, the brown hair allele, covers up the blonde hair allele. So the only time we see these recessive traits is when the genotype is homozygous recessive, or both genes or both alleles are recessive, just like we see here. If we know the genotypes of the parents, we can calculate the percent chance that a child will be born with a specific trait. Let's look at this example. Let's see what the percent chance that parents with a heterozygous pair of alleles for hair color will have a child with brown or blonde hair. So let's look at the mother's chromosomes first, right? The mother has two chromosomes. Each chromosome has an allele or gene that codes for a specific trait, in this case, hair color. This mom is heterozygous, meaning she has one gene on one chromosome that codes for brown hair and is dominant and shown with a capital B, and another chromosome that has an allele for blonde hair, represented with a lowercase b. Therefore, if we're looking for the mom's genotype, we can see it right here, right? The mom has one allele for brown hair, capital B, and one allele for blonde hair, or lowercase b. Note, though, that brown hair is dominant over blonde hair. So therefore, this brown hair allele covers up the blonde hair allele, So this mom would have the phenotype, remember pheno, physical, she would have brown hair. And the same is true for the dad. The dad has the same set of genes. He has two separate chromosomes. One has a brown hair allele, and one has a blonde hair allele. So the father's genotype would be capital B, lowercase b, and his phenotype would also be brown hair, right? Because he has a brown hair allele, or a brown hair gene, and brown is dominant over blonde, so the brown covers up the blonde, and the dad would also have brown hair. So when the alleles are being selected for the gametes, in other words, when the gametes are being formed, the mom can either give this chromosome with the allele for brown hair, or she can give this chromosome with the allele for blonde hair. And it's a 50-50 chance. The mom can either give this chromosome or this chromosome. And same for the dad. The dad can give this chromosome with the brown hair gene or allele, or can give this chromosome with the blonde hair allele. And it's 50-50 chance. So let's look at the possible combinations that the offspring could have depending on which chromosome the mom gives and which chromosome the dad gives, because that's going to determine ultimately what genes are given to the offspring. So if the mom gives a capital B, I'll write that right here, and the dad also gives a capital B, the offspring would have the genotype capital B, which would code, right, for brown hair. The phenotype would be brown hair. Now, if the mom gave the capital B, or the chromosome with the capital B, or the allele for brown hair, so mom gives a capital B, but dad gives the other chromosome with the allele for blonde hair, the child would have the genotype, a heterozygous allele pair, or the genotype capital B, lowercase b, but this would also code for brown hair, right? Because the capital B is dominant, it covers up the lowercase b, or you could say it brown hair is dominant over blonde hair, so we would see brown hair in the child. Now, what if the mom instead gave the lowercase b? So mom gives the lowercase b, but this time dad gives the capital B, right? So dad gives a capital B, mom gives a lowercase b. I'm just going to write the capital B in front of the lowercase b because that's just convention in genetics. We always write capital letters before lowercase letters, mainly because of the way we write, right? At the beginning of a sentence, we always start with a capital P. So just like this in gene pairs, we always write the capital B first. And again, the brown hair gene or allele would cover up the blonde hair gene or allele, and this child would have brown hair. Now, if the mom gave the lowercase b, the chromosome with the lowercase b, and the dad gave the chromosome with the lowercase b, the child would have the genotype lowercase b, and would have blonde hair. So we can see, based on which chromosome the mom can give or gives and which chromosome the dad gives, we have 4 different possible combinations. Because remember, each parent can only give one of their pair of chromosomes. So either the capital B or the lowercase b. And when we do the calculations, there's only 4 different possible combinations that can arise from this. Capital B, capital B, capital B, lowercase b, capital B, lowercase b, or lowercase b, lowercase b. So 4 different possibilities. So when we want to find the chance that a baby has brown hair, what we do is we count up the number of genotypes that would give brown hair as a phenotype. And we can see that we have 1, 2, 3 that would give brown hair. 3 genotypes that would give the phenotype brown hair out of the 4 possible combinations. So the chance that a baby is born with brown hair would be 3 out of 4, or 75%. Now, the same is true when we look at the chance for a baby being born with blonde hair. And what I mean by the same is true, we count the number of possible gene combinations that would give us the blonde-haired phenotype out of the 4 possible combinations, right? So there's 4 possible combinations, but only one of them would give us blonde hair. It would have to be homozygous recessive because blonde hair is a recessive trait. So to figure out the chance that a baby is born with blonde hair, we have 1 out of 4, or 25% chance. So this information that we gathered here from just combining the different genes from the different chromosomes can also let us calculate what's called the phenotypic and the genotypic ratio. Now, a genotypic ratio just shows the ratio of possible gene combinations. Homozygous dominant, 2 capital letters, to heterozygous, a capital and a lowercase letter, to homozygous recessive, 2 lowercase letters. And we just have to go up here and look at these different possible combinations and count them. So out of the 4, only one of them would be homozygous dominant, or 2 capital B's. So I write a 1 there. I write a colon to separate the 2. Next, I'm looking at heterozygous. Out of the 4 possible combinations, 2 of the combinations would be heterozygous. Remember, heterozygous means different, so 1 capital letter, 1 lowercase letter. And there's 2 of those possible combinations. And then for homozygous recessive, lowercase b, only 1 of the 4 combinations would give us the homozygous recessive pair. It's right here. And so the ratio, the genotypic ratio of possible offspring would be 1 to 2 to 1. We say this 1 to 2 to 1, right? Now, the phenotypic ratio shows us the possible ratio of brown hair to blonde hair. So again, we have to look at these possible combinations of phenotype or genotypes, look at what phenotypes they give us, and how many out of the 4 would give us brown hair, and how many of the 4 would give us blonde hair. Well, out of these 4, again, we'd have 1, 2, 3 with brown hair, to 1 out of the 4 with blonde hair, and that would be our phenotypic ratio. So we were able to gather a lot of information about the probability of the children, including the possible the genotypic ratio and the phenotypic ratio. But what if I told you there was an easier way to figure this all out? Well, there is, and it's called Punnett Squares, or using Punnett Squares. So let's look at the same cross, this time using a Punnett Square. All right, so let's look at this easier way using the same trait. We're going to make some Punnett Squares, or we're going to make one Punnett Square. Remember, brown hair is a dominant gene or allele and is represented with a capital B. Blonde hair is recessive and is represented with a lowercase b. So we're going to use 2 parents that are both heterozygous, hetero meaning opposite, right? So each of these parents has a gene or an allele for brown hair and a gene or allele for blonde hair. But remember, brown hair allele is dominant over the blonde hair allele, so when a person has both, the phenotype or physical feature that you're going to see is the dominant trait or the dominant allele. So in this case, mom has brown hair, and it's the same is true for dad because he has a brown hair gene and a blonde hair gene. The brown covers up the blonde, so dad also has brown hair. So, like I said earlier, the mom and the dad can only give one of their 2 alleles. They can either give the capital B or the lowercase b. So when I'm using a Punnett Square, we need to separate the alleles of each parent and put one set of alleles on the side of the Punnett Square and the other set of alleles on the top of the Punnett Square. And so I'm going to do this using different colors. So I'm going to use red for the mom and blue for the dad. So I'm going to start on the side. And so I'm going to take mom's genotype and the 2 alleles, a capital B and a lowercase b, and I'm going to separate them, and I'm going to put them on the side over here on the Punnett Square. I'm going to take the first allele, which is a capital B, and I'm going to put it up here on this row here. So I put the capital B here on this row. I'm going to take that lowercase b, I'm going to put it down here on this row of the Punnett Square. And this 4 square box is what I'm calling the Punnett Square. This is the Punnett Square. Okay, so now I'm going to use blue for the dad's genotype, right? And I'm going to do the same thing, but a little bit different. I'm going to separate these 2 alleles, but this time on the top of the Punnett Square. So I'm going to take the capital B and put it here. So I took this capital B and I put it here. And I take this lowercase b representing the allele for blonde hair and I put it here. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in the Punnett Square. And so I'm just going to start with the top because I have the blue pencil in my hand. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this B and I'm going to put it in every square that's below it. So I'm going to put it in every square in the column. So I'm going to put a capital B here, right? And I'm going to put a capital B down here. So this capital B, I'm just putting it in the 2 boxes below it, right? Then I'm going to take this lowercase b and I'm going to put it in all the boxes below it. So I take this lowercase b and I put it in this box, and I take this lowercase b and I put it in the box down here. And so whatever letters up here at the top of the Punnett Square, I'm putting it in the boxes below, right? Now I need to fill in the mom's genotypes, or the mom's alleles and genotype in the Punnett Square. So I'm going to switch to my red pencil, and I'm going to take this B and I'm going to put it in every box in this row. So I'm going to take this capital B and I'm going to put it in the box, and then I'm going to take this capital B and I'm also going to put it in the box. But see, considering that this is a capital B and I've got a lowercase b already in the box, I'm going to write the capital B in front of the lowercase b, because again, that's just convention. When we're looking at a sentence, we always start a sentence with a capital letter. So our eyes just really like to have a capital letter before the lowercase letter. Okay, I'm going to come down here to the mom's other allele, and I'm just going to put this lowercase b in both boxes to the right of the row, and so I get something that looks like this. Now, the order doesn't really matter of where you put the letters in relationship to one another, except you should always put capital letters before lowercase letters. All right, so the next thing that I like to do is I have the genotypes of the possible offspring. We have 4 possible genotypes of the offspring, but what I like to do when I'm working with Punnett squares is right away I like to write what the phenotype would be based on the genotype right in the box so I know what it is, and it makes life easier later, and I'll show you why here in a second. So if I have a capital B, and remember, capital B codes for brown hair, so if I have 2 capital B's, this child would have brown hair, right? This child with this possible gene combination, which is a heterozygous pair of alleles, different, right? One capital, one lowercase, would also have brown hair, because remember, the capital letter represents a dominant gene, in this case brown hair, and that covers up the blonde hair gene, which is recessive. This genotype would also produce brown hair. In this genotype, because it's 2 lowercase letters, they're both recessive, they both code for blonde hair, this child would have blonde hair. So now I've got all that information in this really convenient box, which we call a Punnett square. These are the alleles of the dad, this was the alleles of the mom, and when I fill in the Punnett square, I get the 4 possible combinations of the offspring. Now I can use these combinations in the Punnett square to determine the genotypic ratio and the phenotypic ratio, and to calculate the percent chance that a child will be born with brown hair or blonde hair. So let's look at this together right here. So the genotypic ratio, again, like I talked about earlier, is just the number of possible combinations that would be homozygous dominant to heterozygous to homozygous recessive. So how many of these 4 possible combinations would be capital B, capital B? Well, I only see 1 right here, right? So I'd write 1, and then I write a colon, and then how many of these 4 would be capital B, lowercase b? Well, I'd have 2 of those. And then how many of these would be lowercase b, lowercase b? Well, just 1, right? So the genotypic ratio is 1 to 2 to 1, which is exactly what we figured out earlier in the video, except we weren't using these really nice Punnett squares. Now, to figure out the phenotypic ratio, now this is really easy if you write those phenotypes in the Punnett square. Like I said this would make our life easier later. Well, this is why I did it, for the phenotypic ratio, partly anyway. So how many of the 4 would produce a child with brown hair? Well, the homozygous dominant and the heterozygous would all produce a child with brown hair. So we have 1, 2, 3 of the 4 possible would produce brown hair, and only 1, this homozygous recessive, 2 little b's, would, or 2 lowercase b's, would produce a child with blonde hair. So the phenotypic ratio is 3 to 1. It's the same phenotypic ratio we got the other way, except this is much faster, right? Then I'm going to try to move this up and make sure we can see at least the inside of the Punnett square, which we can. So what's the percentage chance that the offspring from these parents would have brown hair? Well, again, this is why I wrote those phenotypes with the genotypes. This makes it really easy. Out of the 4 possible combinations here, 3 of these genotypes, these possible genotypes, would give us brown hair, right? 1, 2, 3 out of the 4. So the percent chance would be 3 out of 4 for brown hair, or 75% chance that these parents would produce a child with brown hair. It's the same percentage that we got the other way, just much faster. And then if I look at what's the percentage chance that the offspring of these parents will have blonde hair, again, it's just 1 out of 4, right? Only this gene combination, which is homozygous recessive, 2 little b's or 2 lowercase b's, would produce a child with brown hair. So again, this would be 1 out of 4, or 25% chance that these 2 parents would produce a child with blonde hair. So this is an example of 2 parents, both with brown hair, right? They both have brown hair, yet they still have a 25% chance of producing a child with blonde hair. Okay, so this shows how recessive traits can come out um, from sexual reproduction, which I think is pretty cool. So I hope that you understand the how and why we use Punnett Squares. So please check out my other videos. I'm going to have a couple more videos that show just how to complete Punnett Squares for more examples of just filling out Punnett Squares. But as always, ask your teachers if you have any questions or need any help.